All right, I'm going to have Joe House on in a second to talk about the Russell Westbrook trade, something we taped last night. Also, Ryan Shazier is joining us to do $1 million picks and talk about the undefeated Steelers and whether that can keep going. So I'm taping this. It is Thursday, early afternoon Pacific time. And I've had time to digest the Westbrook trade, talk to some people, and I'm trying to figure out where James Harden is going. Houston is saying all the right things. Houston is saying, oh, no, now they may keep him. And you see tweets out there like Chris Mannix talking about how John Wall and James Harden were playing pickup together. They're making it seem like this is all headed toward James Harden staying. Maybe Westbrook was the issue. I don't agree. I don't think that's what's going to happen. The more I look at this, the more I talk to people, I think now this is a staring match. This is a leverage match. And Houston knows they have to trade James Harden. House and I will talk about this in a second, actually. And you can hear my reaction last night to it, where it's like, he's not going to last the season there. I think it's going to go sooner than that. And I wanted to lay out the landscape. Look at this. I did this whole sheet trying to figure it out, like a whole blueprint. So here are the Harden suitors. If Houston is going to trade Harden, which I think they will, it's really Brooklyn or Philly. But to be fair, let's throw in Golden State. We'll throw in the Clippers. We'll throw in Sacramento as well. So Brooklyn, here are their assets. Karis LeVert, Jared Allen, Landry Shamet. All those guys are pretty young. And Spencer Dinwiddie, who's on the last year of his contract. LeVert signed a new deal, but it's pretty palatable. Allen and Shamet are still on rookie contracts. They also have all their picks and all the swap potentials, things like that. So that's great, except there's no headliner in there. And this is the key if I'm trading James Harden. And this is the key thing for Houston to remember if they're trading James Harden, who is one of the best 4 players of the last 10 years, who is still one of the best 5 or 6 players in the league, who is one of the greatest offensive players in the history of basketball, and who is only 31 years old. You have to get something back for James Harden that's not just a bunch of stuff. In the history of the NBA, it has never worked, ever. There's not one example of trading a superstar for a bunch of pieces, for doing the proverbial $2 bill, trading that away and getting 4 quarters back. It's never worked. It's a terrible idea. You can't do it. You got to get an asset back. Brooklyn does not have the asset. They don't have that wow factor player out of those guys. I like Karis LeVert. He's 26. He's been hurt a lot. That can't be the centerpiece of a trade. They could throw 100 picks at Houston. It doesn't change the fact that they're not getting anything tangible for James Harden. So that's a problem for Brooklyn. We're going to circle back to that in a second. Philly is the other team. Ben Simmons is the obvious piece. Ben Simmons for James Harden. Well, here's the problem with that. Houston can't trade James Harden for somebody who's not as good as James Harden straight up. As good as Ben Simmons has a chance to be, I am a bigger fan of Ben Simmons than most. His same name as my son. I think he's one of the best defensive players in the league. I want to see him on the right team. I feel like there's a version of him where somebody builds a whole team around him, built around his ability to play fast, his ability to be a point forward. You put him around you put shooters around him, play a different kind of speed, and it becomes like the Ben Simmons team. Maybe it's not a team that wins the title, but it's something. You have an identity. And then we can find out how good he is. Because last year he was playing on the same team with Embiid and Tobias Harris and Al Horford, and no real point guard to take pressure off him, no shooting, and it was just a really easy team to defend. If you're getting him, you could build, an identity around him and try to really make him succeed. Build a team that would make him succeed, much like the Ravens did last year with Lamar Jackson. So Philly has Simmons. They have all their picks for the next 7 years, all the pick swap stuff. Those are the 2 obvious candidates. The other teams, Golden State, they could offer Wiggins, Wiseman, Minnesota's top 3 2021 protected pick, bunch of pick swaps. Here's the problem if you're Harden. You're not winning the title if they do that because Klay Thompson's out for the year. So you're going to play with Steph Curry and Draymond Green, and you're not going to win the title. You're in the same spot you are now. So he'll veto that. Clippers, they have no picks at all. It's just Paul George. Would you want Paul George for a year? Would you be excited about that? What do you do if you're the Rockets? Now you're training for Paul George for a year, and then you have to re-sign him for another 5. Would you want to re-sign Paul George for 5 years from what you've seen? Me neither. So they're out. The other one's a wild card, Sacramento. So Sacramento has Marvin Bagley, who I am a big fan of, even though he's been hurt. I don't think he should have ever gone over Luka Doncic in a million years, but I do think he's an asset. I think he has to be taken seriously. I want to see him healthy on a team that gets him the ball. They also have Halliburton, who they drafted, who fell to the 12th pick, who I think is going to be the best player in the 2020 draft when all things are said and done. And they have all their picks and all their swaps. So if Houston was like, fuck it, we're just going to trade James Harden, we don't care where he goes. And Sacramento is like, fuck it, this is our one chance to get a superstar. We'll offer Bagley and Halliburton, and here's a bunch of picks, and we'll put De'Aaron Fox and Harden together, and we'll see where this goes. On paper, that's something. Two problems. Harden would be like, are you kidding me? I'm not going to Sacramento. And then if you're Sacramento, what are you winning with James Harden and De'Aaron Fox and barely anybody else? The only reason I mention it is because Sacramento has a history of being like, yeah, fuck it, and just doing whatever. I think it's Brooklyn or Philly. Okay. So you're saying, well, wait a second, are we sure it's just Brooklyn and Philly? Well, as I said before, Houston has to get an available young star for Harden. They have to get a younger centerpiece that they can build something around with Christian Wood. Some of the picks they got back. Keep your fingers crossed that John Wall is good again and either keep him or trade him. But you got to get a young centerpiece. Simmons is the best centerpiece in the league that might be available for James Harden. Here are the other possibilities. Michael Porter Jr., hold that thought. Marvin Bagley, James Wiseman. And then it drops a level. It goes to Lauri Markkanen, RJ Barrett, and then Anthony Edwards, they're not trading him to Minnesota. Unavailable young stars. This is a very important category because these are all the people who will not be traded for James Harden because their teams just aren't going to do it. Jason Tatum, Luka Doncic, De'Aaron Fox, Jamal Murray. So maybe a year ago, you would have said, oh, maybe Jamal Murray for James Harden. No, Denver's not doing that. Devin Booker, no way. Trae Young, Atlanta's decided to build the whole city around him. They'll never admit defeat on the Luka Doncic trade, which is still one of the 5 worst trades the last 10 years. Jaylen Brown, I don't see it. I think he means too much to Boston and the city on and off the court. The Tatum Brown thing, you have 2 guys who want to be in Boston who signed big contracts to stay there. You can build around those dudes for the next 10 years. The trade would be Jaylen Brown and Marcus Smart for Harden if you're going to make up a trade. Boston's not doing it. They're not winning the title with Tatum and James Harden and a bunch of, role players. It's not happening. Bradley Beal, no. Joel Embiid, no. Ja Morant, no way. Zion, no. Karl Towns, no, and it doesn't make sense anyway. Donovan Mitchell, no. DeAndre Ayton, Chris Paul's in that team, so no. LaMelo Ball, ironically, I don't think he's available yet. I think Charlotte actually wants to see how that progresses. Plus, what the hell are they going to do with James Harden? So back to the original question. Ben Simmons is the best trade piece for James Harden, which means James Harden is going to get traded to Philly, right? Well, I don't think so yet, because if I'm Philly, I'm looking at this and I'm going, I know you're not taking Karis LeVert, Jared Allen, Spencer Dinwiddie, and a bunch of draft picks for James Harden. I know you're not doing that. That's not happening. So here's my offer. My offer is Ben Simmons. And then Houston goes, no, we got to get picks back. And Philly goes, no, our offer is Ben Simmons. And you can get 80% of Harden's value for Ben Simmons. So 2 problems here. One is Daryl Morey, the former Houston GM, went to Philly. And Tillman Fertitta, who let him out of the contract, God only knows what happened with that whole thing, lets him out. Daryl's going to spend more time with his family, and 2 weeks later, he's Philly's new running everybody guy. So Houston is not going to get snookered by Philly. They're not going to make a deal where on paper you go, wow, they traded James Harden. All they got back was Ben Simmons. Philly knows this. They also know there's no better offer out there. If Klay Thompson was healthy, if Klay Thompson's ACL never happened, they'd probably be worried about Golden State, because then you could talk about that Wiseman, Wiggins, the Minnesota pick, future picks, and you could have Harden, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green, Steph Curry, and that's a contender, and Harden would talk himself into that. But with no Klay Thompson, he's not talking himself into that. So Philly's looking at this going, we win. Ben Simmons, they're not going to get a better offer. Brooklyn's looking at this going, shit, we have all these assets, but we don't have quite enough to get Harden yet. We need to get a second asset. All right, so what do you do if you're Brooklyn? You got to bring a third team in there. You go back to the available young stars: Simmons, Porter, Wiseman, Bagley, Markkanen. The most appealing guy on that list is Michael Porter Jr., who conflicting reports on whether he's completely untouchable or almost untouchable, and the Drew Holiday, who knows if he got brought up. Brooklyn's only chance is to overpay for Michael Porter Jr. and then put him into their package. So here's how that would work. A 3-team trade where Denver, just for the privilege of including Michael Porter and rerouting him to Houston, Denver would be getting back Jared Allen, Spencer Dinwiddie, Landry Shamet, and 2 Brooklyn firsts. So we'll give, let's say, the 2021 and 23 Brooklyn first-round picks. All for the privilege of sending Michael Porter and Gary Harris to Houston. All right. So here's this trade now. If it's 3 teams, Brooklyn, Denver, Houston. Brooklyn gets James Harden and PJ Tucker. Right? So now PJ Tucker, by the way, very close friend of Kevin Durant, University of Texas guy. So now you have James Harden, PJ Tucker, Kyrie Irving, DeAndre Jordan, Joe Harris. You got to, and some of the role guys they signed. You've got enough. You at least have your starting 5, and it's freaking loaded. Denver, they get Jared Allen, Spencer Dinwiddie, Landry Shamet, and 2 Brooklyn firsts. They could also spin Jared Allen if they want. If they decide, hey, we have Jokic, it would be weird to play them together. Jared Allen has real trade value. You could turn him into, like, let's say they called the Celtics and they're like, hey, give us Robert Williams, give us Romeo Langford and 2 first-round picks. I don't know. You could turn Jared Allen into 4 assets if you want. A lot of teams would want him because $3.9 million, he could defend the rim. Houston, here's what they get out of this trade. Karis LeVert, Michael Porter Jr., Gary Harris. They get 2 Brooklyn firsts, and they get pick swaps in 2022, 2024, and 2026 with Brooklyn. So if you're Brooklyn, you're giving up Allen, you're giving up Dinwiddie, you're giving up Shamet, you're giving up Allen, you're giving up 3 of your first and 3 pick swaps, all for the right to put Durant, Harden, and Kyrie in the same team. That seems like a lot. I don't really like this trade that much for anyone other than Houston. My point is, this is the only way Brooklyn can trump whatever Philly has to offer. If they can somehow figure out how to get Michael Porter Jr. from Denver. And now Houston has multiple assets. They get the LeVert and the Porter, plus some picks. And now you're talking. Maybe Jared Allen is in the Houston side of that trade. Guess what? I'd still rather have Ben Simmons. So the important thing for Houston, try to get the Michael Porter, or try to get Bagley from Sacramento. Try to get even Markkanen from Chicago. Try to get one more asset that Brooklyn can use some of their assets to go get. I still feel like if they paid 140 cents on the dollar for Michael Porter, Denver would have to consider it because they have a chance to win the title this year. Porter's their X factor, right? If you build a much deeper, better team around Jokic and Murray, maybe you're in the mix. Who knows with the Lakers? Maybe this is the year LeBron gets old. We already know the Warriors are out. You just never know. They're not that far away. Porter's the X factor. We don't know if he can play crunch time and defend, wings on the other teams, and whether he's going to be happy as the third option on a team. All this stuff, who knows? So that's Brooklyn's best chance, and Brooklyn would end up with Harden and Tucker. And they would have a 3 to 4 year run. And basically they would be all in the same way the Clippers went all in, the same way the Lakers went all in, the same way the Bucks kind of halfway went all in. It doesn't make a ton of sense to me, but I think that's what they would have to do. And here's why that's important. even if there was the hint of a 3-teamer, Brooklyn's trying to get more assets to throw more at Houston, then Philly has to change their stance. And they have to say, looks like we got to offer a little more than Simmons. And this is where I think it lands. I think Mike Scott and Terrence Ferguson go in the trade because they're expirings. PJ Tucker goes in the trade. So Philly gets Harden and Tucker. They gave up Ben Simmons, Mike Scott, and Ferguson. They gave up 2 firsts, unprotected, and a pick swap. And then call it in. And the reason they gave up more than they thought they had to give up is because they're worried that Brooklyn is just going to say, we're going to figure out how to get the assets and we'll try to get young guys from other teams. We have 3-team potential, 4-team potential. We're going hell or high water to get this happening. And then Philly eventually says, what are we doing? We have a chance to get James Harden. And they have a chance to put James Harden with Joel Embiid. I think the trade looks something like that. I think it will happen sooner than we think, because if we've learned anything about the history of the NBA, once a guy is unhappy and once a guy wants out, it always happens sooner than later. We rarely have wow, we're on month 4 of this guy being super unhappy. It usually happens fast. And in general, we should not be surprised when there's a mega NBA trade anymore. So that's my prediction. I still think James Harden's going to Philly. I felt that way the whole time, really since the draft. I felt like Westbrook was going to end up in Washington before the draft. I don't know what happened. I don't know what held up exactly, but it eventually happened. And the Rockets want to get away from this Harden thing because he's going to be unhappy the whole year. They want to start over, start fresh. They never won anything with him anyway. They never made the finals with him anyway. Good luck, Godspeed, so long. And he goes to Philly, and I think that's how this plays out.